Application Lifecycle Management. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Senior Fast Track Program Manager, Chris Knowles. So without any further delay, Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Janice. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're attending. I want to thank you for joining us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping on the Fast Track team side. Just a couple of reminders. We'd like to ask you to please remember to keep yourself muted. Make sure to please enter your questions through the message interface in your browser window. Please make sure and give us your feedback. And then, of course, if you have any questions, please follow up with your Fast Track Program Manager. And as Janice mentioned, this session is being recorded. Thank you very much. We're going to talk about today, we're going to walk through some concepts around application lifecycle management. We're going to talk about solutions and kind of give a brief introduction to solutions. We'll also be talking about the development process, some of the mechanisms that are used in that process, tools like the solution packager and package deployer. We'll talk a little bit about the Visual Studio Online and Team Foundation service. And then we'll also have some time for Q&A. We want to make sure that you get a good overview of these topics today during this discussion. If you do have questions, please feel free to put them in and we'll answer them as we can. We'll try and hold them until the Q&A session at the end unless we believe that it's pertinent to where we are in the content. What is a solution? A solution is really just a package that contains configurations, customizations, and settings that can be imported into a Dynamics 365 instance. And why do we use solutions? Well, solutions are a very handy way of managing customizations to your Dynamics 365 instance. There are a lot of different ways that can be done. Typically, when we talk about solutions, these exist as individual sets of packages or individual sets of customizations. They are typically authored by a publisher. And then, of course, they're very handy for moving these sets of customizations between your deployments. What is a publisher? A publisher is the person who is the author of a solution. Typically, when you first get your Dynamics 365 instance, it comes with a default publisher by default that it's installed. What we typically recommend is that you go and you change the default publisher to a publisher that is suitable for your organization. And what that does is it kind of separates, it creates some separation between the customizations that you make in your environment and what we call the system solution or the very base solution that comes in your Dynamics 365 instance. To make changes to the solution publisher, what you do is you would go to Settings, Customizations, and click Publishers, and then you can create a new publisher for your organization, and then you can make that the default publisher for your organization as well. As part of that, you want to make sure that you change the prefix. The default prefix that comes with that is new. We make sure that you change that to something that is a bit more, again, aligned to your organization and what you're doing. So before I mention the system solution is installed by default, and it is the base solution that comes with all of the out-of-the-box components that comprise the solution for Dynamics 365. It's important that you understand that when you first receive this solution, this default solution is completely open, and other than things that are marked as what we call managed properties, which we'll talk about a little bit later, you do have the ability to change these or add on to them. You have the ability to create new components. Now, again, I'm not going to go into the whole concept of customization and what that is. I will provide you some information at the end of this discussion that would allow you to go and see more information around customization and the concepts around it. But the idea is that we're assuming you have kind of a base level of understanding around customization and the concepts with that, and then this is how you would bundle these into solutions. So when you go to create a solution, typically what we tell people is, if you want to just customize your instance, you could do that. There are some challenges to creating customizations in what we call the default solution. It makes it a little bit more difficult to manage, and it also makes it very hard to understand sometimes what changes were made when. So we have a way of using solutions that allows you to, when you create customizations, you can actually create packages out of a development environment, and then you can take those and move them into other environments, and you would do that using the concept of solutions. I recommend that you go in and you just customize your production instance, for example, because there are inherent issues that can come with that if you make mistakes. But you also have the capability to create customizations in an environment and then go forward and take those as solutions into your other environments. What we also recommend is for your default solution, the first thing you should probably do is go to your solutions page and create an export of your default solution. That way, if your instance were to become completely messed up, you do have a backup of your default solution. You also have the ability, when you go to the solution page, you do have the ability to see more information about the solution, the components that are contained in the solution, and the way that you can go about dealing with the information that you've put into that solution. Now, there are two types of solutions that we support. The first type is what we'll call unmanaged. Unmanaged solutions are typically, when a solution is first created, it's an unmanaged solution. It can be modified. It has the ability to be transported between other environments. You could have multiple solutions within an unmanaged solution, and you also have the ability to use these as logical groupings of information. However, it is important to know that when you have everything as unmanaged, it still sits in a very large unmanaged pool of configurations. We also have managed solutions. Now, there are two different things about managed solutions, and sometimes it creates some confusion with our customers. The first thing is, yes, our partners and ISVs do use managed solutions to create packages for their customers and their clients. And if you've had an interaction or an experience with an engagement with partners, they may have provided you some of their managed solutions as part of what they do. They have the ability to create these as products, if you will, or add-ons to the Dynamics 365 instance to allow you to do things functionally without you having to go in and create all the customizations yourself. This allows them to also occasionally provide you updates to the managed solution. Our ISVs are very good at doing those types of things for our customers and allowing them to get updates to these managed solutions. And so those are typically the way that products that are brought in, third-party products, are brought into a Dynamics 365 instance. So, as I mentioned before, when you go in and you actually go through the process of creating a solution, you're going to want to move that solution potentially from one environment to another. You may just want to be saving it. So when you go, you're going to take an unmanaged solution that has certain properties. So when would you want to use an unmanaged solution? Potentially if you need to go and edit customizations XML file for a sitemap or ribbons. If you're going to move an unmanaged solution, as I was mentioning before, to a new organization, you may want to make changes in your new organization. Sometimes when you have different business units, you may have an organization that represents one business unit and an organization that represents another business unit, and you want to be able to use different unmanaged solutions, or you may want to use one as a base for the other. There are a lot of different reasons that you may want to use these. Again, it also allows you to create a backup of all of the current customizations that you have in the unmanaged solution that you're exporting. Now, a managed solution cannot be exported, and it can only be created when you're exporting an unmanaged solution. So when you go to export a solution, what happens is it will ask you if you want to export the solution as an unmanaged solution or a managed solution. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Importing solutions. So once you've exported a solution, you're going to want to import that solution potentially into another instance. So if you're going to import an unmanaged solution, again, it's very important when you're looking to move some of your existing customizations, for example, maybe your base set of customizations into a new organization, would bring that unmanaged solution from your existing environment by exporting it, and then you would go through the process of importing that into your new organization, and that would bring those customizations over. You actually have to go through the process of taking the file that is created when you do the export and then importing that file into the new organization. And then what happens is all of the changes that come in will come in and be applied into that environment. Now, if you've changed something, if you've changed base components in that unmanaged organization, then what happens is those changes get applied to the new environment and they cannot be uninstalled. So it's a very important thing to know with managing unmanaged solutions. Managed solutions, what happens is when you take the managed solution, if you've exported your configurations and you're moving them into a new environment as a managed solution, then that solution definition is locked. In other words, nothing in that solution can be changed in the solution. It could be customized on top of, potentially, depending on how the managed solution and the components in it have been defined. This is also very handy. For example, you tell people one of the best processes to follow here is when you develop unmanaged and deploy managed. And this allows you better control over moving those customizations into other environments and needing to potentially remove them if there is a problem or uninstall them. Now, I was mentioning before, typically when we talk to customers about managing solutions and managing the application lifecycle management, we typically recommend 3 environments. A development environment, which is a sandbox. A testing environment, UAT, QA, test, whatever you want to call it, is another sandbox, and then you have your production instance, and these are 3 separate instances. So, for example, you take your first set of development, your first set of customizations, and you say, okay, now I have these, I'm going to bundle these into a solution and to migrate that solution into my testing environment. Then the solution will be tested at that point. Now, of course, as anything happens, when you go to testing, typically, if users find issues, bugs, potentially challenges, that feedback you take back into your development environment, you make the changes accordingly, and then you migrate your new solution into your testing environment. And at that point, when that solution is validated and your users sign off and say, yep, this is great, it looks wonderful, or you've gone through your system testing or your QA testing and everything is working as appropriate, you then migrate that solution into your production environment. Now, at its most simple level of construction, this can be done using the solution export and import mechanisms that are provided out of the box in Dynamics 365. And then, of course, as with anything, once you've gotten through that process, by the time you're migrating, as you all know, by the time you migrate your changes from your testing environment to your production environment, your users are already, hey, when do I get the next set of changes? So at that point, you then begin to start your changes in the next environment. Now, one of the things that we've added the capability to do is to update solutions. So it's something that allows you to kind of create more of a version mentality around the way that you manage solutions, and it allows you to have greater control over, versus taking a solution and having to uninstall it and install a new one. You have the ability to just apply your changes as an update, and what will happen is they'll get applied. The solution will update the appropriate components or it will overwrite them accordingly. Again, this is where looking at the differences between an unmanaged model and a managed model, there are some benefits to driving a managed model. While the managed solution itself, can't be changed, you don't want to uninstall it and then have to reinstall it, so you would use the update. And then if you're going to add a whole new set of changes, we call that an upgrade. But if you're just making a couple of minor changes, or for example, if it's what we call a break-fix model, then you would simply do what we call a solution patch. And we'll talk a little bit more about those capabilities in a minute. But those are things that we've added the capability to do with Dynamics 365 and solution management. And then, of course, when you apply an update, it can actually be rolled back. So if there is a problem with the update, it can be rolled back to the previous version, minimizing the impact on your production users. Now, occasionally, there is the need to delete or uninstall a solution. For unmanaged solutions, all this really does is delete the solution definition record in the database. It doesn't change the components. It doesn't change the changes to the components for an unmanaged solution. For a managed solution, if you delete the solution, it will uninstall the managed solution as well as all the components and data associated with it. So you have to make sure that if you are going to delete a solution, you understand the ramifications that can be accompanied with that. Now, what does that look like? So in the solution management model, the screen that we're showing you now kind of paints a picture. At the very bottom, you can see we have the system solution, which is the base solution that comes in. Now, on top of that, we've installed two managed solutions, Managed Solution A and Managed Solution B. Now, what happens is when you install managed solutions, they stack on top of each other, so in the order that they are installed. So Managed Solution A was installed first, and Managed Solution B was installed next. And what we did was, because we've installed those in, now they've made some changes along the way to different pieces from the system solution. But those components kind of comprise all of the managed solutions that we have. Then on top of that, we've deployed our own changes. So we have an unmanaged solution C that exists here more as a logical container for definition. And then we have an unmanaged solution D. Now, we could say that these are different releases that we have where, maybe we're just doing unmanaged solutions that kind of look like component updates as we're going along, and we're not using managed solutions to deploy. We're using unmanaged solutions to kind of keep all of our customizations in one big pool and simplify our deployment process. Now, what would actually happen at the application level when all of these things are kind of layered on top of each other, you can see. So the entity change that exists, the entity that existed in the system solution is changed in the unmanaged area and unmanaged solution D. The sitemap you see here is changed from the default sitemap in managed solution B, and then there are more changes in unmanaged solution C. So then what happens here is that the sitemap that you see is the sitemap from unmanaged solution C. And then managed solution A added a template. That template is what is seen at the application level, and then of course a web resource is added in the unmanaged customizations. It just sits in the pool, and that's what you see at the application level. Now, you have to make sure that when you're preparing a managed solution to be installed, you just want to remember the order in which they're installed and kind of keep that in your mind. It's always good to keep, when you build a solution, make sure that you're following solution best practices so that your solution doesn't necessarily interfere with other solutions. This is something that our ISVs and partners are also very sensitive to when they create these solutions, managed solutions that they'll give to you as part of a project. They have to make sure that they create the solutions in a way that they don't necessarily interfere with other managed solutions or potentially behavior that you may customize on top of that. One of the things that we do when we go through the concept of kind of merging the behavior of solutions is we try and determine, we want to make sure that the functionality of the solution and the system itself is not impacted. So we try to make sure, the presentation layer may potentially suffer depending on how things are customized and configured in your different solutions. But when we go to do this merging process, when solutions are added incrementally, sometimes you may see some differences in the presentation layer, so because we'll make some changes based on, make determinations based on how the changes affect the functionality of the customization versus the presentation layer. So it's always something to take into consideration when you're going through that process. when solutions begin to conflict with each other, another thing that we'll do as part of this, again, at the end of this, we'll be providing you some additional information. But what you want to look out for is when you have these different layers of solution, you always want to keep in mind how these things layer and how they are modified and what ends up happening up at the client level. And the reason that that's so important is because, again, as you go through time, you're going to be adding customizations on top of customizations on top of customizations. And ultimately, you're going to want to have a way to kind of keep those customizations easily manageable, at least as best you can. Typically what happens is what happens usually is that the most recent customizations will be the ones that are displayed, depending on what was installed and how it was installed. If a managed solution is installed and you have installed on top of unmanaged components, sometimes what happens is that creates a conflict, and then you have to go through the ability to maybe work with your provider of that managed solution to get an update so that it will install correctly.
Hey, Chris, we have a question in the chat.
Okay.
It says that what's the best approach if we are trying to migrate from on-premise to online and on-premise organization has managed solution?
Well, we could probably do an entire 2-hour discussion on that, but typically the easiest answer is if your managed solutions are coming from a third-party provider, then you're going to want to make sure that the environment you're going to migrate those managed solutions into are supported, the version level that you're going to be migrating into. Additionally, you're probably going to want to go through and call out your customizations and configurations and then evaluate those against the version that you're moving into for Dynamics. Now, if you're at 2016 update 1 and you're migrating to Dynamics 365, most everything will probably migrate fairly cleanly, with very few exceptions. But ultimately, if you're going through that on-premise to online migration, it really depends on what version you're on and how far back you are in the version chain, whether you're 2011, 2013, 2013 update 1, 2015 update 1. We do have a significant amount of published guidance on kind of the differences between the versions. Sometimes you may want to look at things that you may have customized in a particular version. You may not even need to do that anymore. For example, in Dynamics 365, we put out the editable grid as an example. If you have editable grids that you've customized or custom controls that you have, you may want to look at replacing that customization with the out-of-the-box behavior. Those are things that you just have to take time in a development instance and migrate try and take your solution export out, and then you're going to have to migrate things individually in as you can. Usually we recommend if you're going through that process, you work with a partner to kind of help you get the basic tenets of moving that solution or set of solutions over into an online environment. So, I'm not sure if that answered your question 100%, but we put a follow-up just at the end of this. Again, we'll provide you with some links to give you more information on doing a lot of this in a lot more detail. But a good question, and always something that you have to do. Again, you can also evaluate your model of using managed and unmanaged, or again, going back to your provider of the managed solution and confirming that it will be supported when you migrate that to your new Dynamics 365 organization. Okay. Now, one of the things that I misclick here. Okay, let me just finish talking about the resolving conflicts. So what you want to make sure when you're dealing with conflicts in the resolution layer here, you can see that there's a customization of a button in the solution. or a configuration of a button. Then you have a managed solution A, and that has a button that it contains. Then you have managed solution B that also contains a button. Then you have an unconfigured solution that hides button A. Ultimately, what you end up seeing at the client level is button S from the system solution and button B from solution B. And so this is how the solution conflict is managed using the ribbon customizations as an example. Always remember that the unmanaged customizations are always the top layer of solution chain. So if you have a pool of unmanaged customizations that exist in your development environment, those, if you've made direct customizations in there, those are going to sit at the very top. And so you always want to be aware of that. Now, again, this is where you can also use the premise of developing unmanaged and then exporting those specific customizations to a managed solution, and then you apply these managed solutions yourself. And that can make the management of those changes much easier. It also, again, as we said before, makes it easier if you have to make changes to those quickly. It makes it easier to manage that process. One of the things that we've provided, and I mentioned this before, one of the ways that we've provided, capabilities we've provided for this is to clone a solution, basically creating a patch. The idea is something really simple. As an example, you publish a form and you publish the solution in your production environment, and you realize that there's an error in the form, something simple, a label, something along those lines where you just need a quick change. So if you want to clone a patch, you just go back to where that base solution is stored, and you would clone a patch for that solution, and then it just pulls in the pieces that it needs to do to create the clone solution, and then all you have to do at that point, you set the version number, and then you go and you do the specific customization, and then you take that patch, you would export it, managed or unmanaged, you make the determination at that point, and then you can take that patch and apply that patch to the solution in your system. When you clone a solution, what happens is that it actually will take all of the patches and bring everything up into a new version of the whole solution. So in other words, if you think about this, one of the way that we kind of describe it and delineate it is this almost the difference between upgrade and update. So a patch, if you clone a patch, that's more like an update, relatively small in scope. You're not making a lot of changes, something relatively simple, even a break fix example. When you clone a solution, that's a new release, or at least a new minor release, if you will. So that's more of an upgrade. We should have more in that, and it's going to bring all of that components together and roll that up, and it basically creates a new version of the original solution. And this is a way that we've provided to do some solution management out of the box without having to use programmatic intervention or do other things to kind of create the concept of versioning as you go along. So before we move on to the next phase and talk about the development process, I just want to make sure, are there any other questions related to solution goals that we need to touch on?
Yeah, so a couple of questions, Chris. Basically, Balamurugan is asking, what is recommended in productions, managed or unmanaged? I believe the recommended process is the managed solution, right?
Yeah, so that's a tough question.
Yes.
We have customers who do it both ways, and I've had customers argue with me, which is fine. It's good. It's good because it's always lively discussion on which process is actually better. Recommend is that you don't keep everything in what we call the default solution, which is the system solution. I see the question of what's the difference between the default solution and the system solution. They are the same. They're the same. Ultimately, what happens is that default solution is the big pool, if you will, of all of your customizations if you're keeping everything unmanaged. Again, I think you saw the picture earlier. We talk about, you have two unmanaged solutions within the larger unmanaged pool of solutions. And again, that's more just a logical identifier. It doesn't really allow you to back those changes out, but you can at least determine, for example, if you are creating a solution to go with each of your releases that you're providing through your process, you at least can see what customizations were included as part of that. You don't have the more granular control of potentially uninstalling that solution if you have to, but you do have the ability to kind of create that delineation and separation. But ultimately, it's the same. Those are the same things. So a question just popped up. Any plans to integrate Visual Studio Team Foundation Services? Yes, actually, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So, okay. All right, so there's a couple of questions popping up. We will talk a little bit about Visual Studio Team Services in the next segment. So stand by, and you'll definitely get some more information on that. Let's see here. If the recommendation is managed, we have a situation. Application is not fully built yet. It's getting developed in a progressive manner. Hence, applying a managed solution will increase many layers. So here's what I would say to that. Again, what I would consider is it's okay to build it in layers in the unmanaged pool in your development environment. Remember, I said early on, build unmanaged, deploy managed. And again, not everybody agrees with that. That's why I said, it depends on your developers, your skill set, your ability to manage that information, how you choose to. It's really more of a choice. I can't say the Microsoft recommended way because we have customers who do it both ways and do it successfully. It just depends on what's easier for you to do. If you're building it in layers, if you're deploying it in layers, it just depends on how connected those layers are and whether it makes sense, or if you're going to deploy it as one solution. And once you create that base solution that you're building, that could become the managed solution that you deploy. Building it in layers is okay, but if you're not going to deploy it until you're done, then I would say, yeah, just keep building it in your layers, but don't deploy it. But if you're deploying it along the way, you may have to decide. One of the things that you can't do necessarily is go back and forth. There's no easy way to go back and forth between your solution models. So it's something you definitely want to put some thought into as you move forward. It is okay to deploy those layers as managed solutions because they'll just stack on top of each other. And ultimately, what you could do is, if there's some segmentation to, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the development process, but if there's some segmentation to how you're developing it, then, you could have a managed solution for a particular area. I've seen customers create managed solutions for a certain subset of entities, and then a managed solution for another subset of entities, and they have those divided by developers, and those developers work on those individual solutions, and when they're done, they deploy those. If they have to coordinate them for a larger release, as an example, then they'll work together, and then ultimately they end up deploying each together as one release, but it's still two managed solutions. That answers your question. Let's see here. What's the definition of a patch, or what's the purpose of a patch? So ultimately, it's just lighter than having to create an entire whole new solution. When you create a new upgrade, if you will, of a solution, it pulls in all the required components. And a patch doesn't require you to have all of a patch itself. When you just clone a patch, it doesn't require you to have all of those components. When you clone the solution, it's going to pull everything into it, including all of the patches that you've created, and it's going to pull it up into the new version of whatever this solution was originally. Okay, let's see. Next question. Let's assume I want to refresh my development org with production backup. Due to the dependency working on development, with real data. Make an org backup, we'll end up working on top. Yes. Yeah, that's a possibility. And, it's consider that, that's one of the things that you may not be able to do from the box. If you do a full copy where it copies everything like that, you don't have the ability necessarily to deconstruct that managed solution. Now, it is your managed solution, but again, you do run the risk. I would say if you're going to do a refresh, I would do it more of most customers do a refresh to QA or a refresh to org. You can extract, another thing you can do is extract the unmanaged solution, and this is what I'd have to some of the guys who actually know this in a bit more detail. If there was a way to take that unmanaged solution and then be able to replace that somehow in your dev environment, I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head. Typically, if customers refresh because they want production data, they're either using an unmanaged pool together or they're using managed solutions that are third party, and so they're not making, the only thing they've done is customized on top of those, which means that the default solution, the default unmanaged solution, or I shouldn't say default, the unmanaged solution is going to sit on top of those managed solutions, is going to contain all those customizations, and they're migrating that entire piece all the way across, and that's what's going to get copied back. So, yeah, it does create a little bit of complexity in that type of refresh model.
Do we have any thought process on that?
That's what it would. We may want to take that offline, Coles, as a follow-up. That last question.
Yeah.
Because again, that's another one that would potentially, off the top of my head, there may be a way to do that if the managed solution got installed and you don't have a backup of the unmanaged solution that created it. I'm not sure if there's a way to deconstruct the managed solution. There may be in a way that may allow you to then recreate it as an unmanaged, but I would need to, again, go back into the particulars. It's kind of tied to the question you asked me earlier. Yeah, we can talk about that at the end of the session. The question was, please let me know how to follow up on a certain question where I haven't gotten the answer. So, understood. All right. So if there are no more questions, we will move forward and talk some about the development process. So, in the picture that you see, this kind of discusses the development process in two steps. One, there's kind of an initial setup step, and how you would go about managing your development model if you were using Visual Studio Online and Team Foundation Services or Team Foundation Server as your platform. If you have another development platform, or if you have a way, like for example, if you're just looking to manage your configurations in some form of source control, some of the techniques that we'll talk about through this process you'll be able to leverage. Some of them you may not. Some of the things that we have are specifically oriented towards that. But we'll talk about some of the tools that we have that will help facilitate that process. So as you can see, we'll talk about this as kind of the initial steps of getting your development model into Visual Studio Online, and then what your subsequent iterations would potentially look like. Okay. So when you go to the process of doing this, one of the tools that you'll use is a tool called Solution Packager, and Solution Packager is included with the SDK for Dynamics 365. Now, if you've downloaded the SDK, you'll find this tool in the bin directory, and then there's a lot of good information online on how to use this tool in a lot of detail. It is a command line driven tool, but basically what it allows you to do is it allows you to decompose a compressed solution file into XML files. And then the reason that it does that is because then you can take the XML files and put them into a source control system and then manage the versioning of those XML files versus what customers used to do is they would just take the solution zip, for example, and load that into a source control file, and basically it was just treated as a blob. There was no validation, of course. But ultimately, they could at least keep versions of their solution so that they know what they had over time. As I mentioned before, you can find that in the bin folder once you've downloaded and extracted the Microsoft Dynamics 365 SDK. And then in the process that we're going to talk about, one of the other tools that you would need to get is the Microsoft Dynamics 365 Developer Toolkit, and you would find that in the Visual Studio Marketplace. And all you have to do is look for Microsoft Dynamics 365 Developer Toolkit. It's released by the Dynamics CRM PG. It's currently in public beta 1, and that version does include solution management. I know a couple of months back they did not yet have the solution management released, but they do now have that. And they applied an update as recently as last week. So that public beta is going, and it's available to anyone. So if you're using Visual Studio Online or Visual Studio and you want to look at doing development and tying that into the source control for Visual Studio, this is what you would need, and it gives you the ability to create the templates for managing your solutions. And we'll talk some about that as we move forward. But what Solution Packager does is it allows you to decompose into the XML files, and then you can actually identify those XML files to be pulled back in to create a solution. So let's see. So just to take a step back, our development process. So the first thing that we would want to do in using Visual Studio Online and Team Foundation servers, we want to define a solution structure. And then the next step that we would do is to create the solution structure in Dynamics 365 and Studio Online. And the reason is because you want those to be identical so that it's easier to map everything back into the system. Then you would go through the process of customizing your solution, import that solution using the solution packager. You export the solution you can either use it using SDK or you can do it from the interface. Then you would actually use the solution packager to break it apart, and then you would check in those pieces into the solution in Visual Studio. And that's kind of at a high level, those are the steps that you would take. So what do those look like? Well, the first thing here, in defining the solution structure, one of the things that, and again, this is just a recommendation. This is not something that we're saying is the way to do it. There are a lot of different ways that you may want to break apart your solutions. As I mentioned before, some customers will, do everything around particular entities or particular functionality, keep a separate one for sitemap, those types of things. In this particular model, what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, we're going to break this up into client extension, data, sitemap and application ribbons, security, templates, reports, plugins, and processes. And then here are the different types of components that are included in those types of solutions. And then the reason that we specify the import order is because this says when you're doing these different solutions and then you're creating that ultimate package that you're going to want to put back into, or the series of solution packages that you're going to want to put back into your Dynamics instance, this is the order that they should go in. And so these are the types of things that you want to consider when you're doing this and you're defining a structure where this could be managed. A question on Visual Studio really quickly. We support 2013, 2015, and we're in the process of supporting 2017. So when you create the solution structure, you want to make sure that you have it created for both, again, Visual Studio, and you want to have the same solution structure in Dynamics 365 in your development environment, in your sandbox environment. And then you want to make sure that you've got them both exactly the same, and that ensures that you've got some degree of management between alignment between the two. go through the process you go through then, and you customize your solution, and you've got all your customizations done, then you can go through the process of actually exporting your solutions. Now, if you want to go through an automated process, then you can use the SDK, and we show a brief snippet of code here to give you kind of an idea of how that process works. You can also just export the solution yourself and then go through the process of using the solution packager to unpack it. So as you can see here, the example that we show on this page demonstrates how you would use the solution packager to basically unpack this. See that when you use the solution packager tool, you're basically giving it where the zip file is, and that's how all solutions, when you export them out of your instance, they come out as a zip file. And then you basically give that the name, and then you tell it where you want it to put it, and then it's going to give you the information. It's going to tell you everything that it sees and how it's going about the process of extracting them, and then it tells you when it's complete. And there's a whole lot of information on the package, on the solution packager. Again, we can provide those links at the end of this discussion, but ultimately, this is the way that you would then get those components that you would move into the proper directories for Visual Studio that you could then check in. So you take those extracted solution components, and then you go into Visual Studio, and then you tell Visual Studio that it needs to go through and look at the solution folders that you've created in your Visual Studio solution. It will pull those files in, and then actually you can go and check them in at that point. And that's kind of the first set of steps that you would follow to kind of get your solution out of your Dynamics 365 development instance into Visual Studio Online. At that point, you're basically just going through the process again. Again, you want to make sure that you're always getting the latest version before you start your process. That's always a good best practice, that when you go through the process of doing the extract, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to always pulling down the latest version. That is an absolute necessity in terms of how you go about that process. So now, when you've gone through those, just really quickly, I apologize. So again, as I mentioned before, once you check in the way that you go through and you check it in is you pull the elements out, you put them into the directories that align to the directories you created in your project in Visual Studio Online. And then you tell Visual Studio Online, hey, go look for new files. It sees them, it brings them in, and then you can check them in. And at that point, you have that now in Visual Studio for you to manage from a source control perspective. You always want to make sure that when you're going through your development process that you are getting the latest version. You go through basically the same steps. You pack those contents into a solution. So this way, if anybody's made any changes in Visual Studio, other people have made changes, you would pull all of those into that solution. Then you would pack that together. You would basically then take that solution and import it using whatever tools you want to use. You can use the interface, but you'd use the solution packager to create the package from Visual Studio and the solution file, the zip file, and you would import that solution into your Dynamics instance. Then you can go through and do your customizations. And then you follow the same process of doing the things that you need to do for check-in. And then, of course, you can go through and look to see if there are any conflicts in Visual Studio. So what does that look like? So again, you always want to make sure, as I said, that you go and you get the latest version when you're in Visual Studio, that you've got the latest version of all the solution components from everyone who's working on that particular project. You're going to use the solution packager tool to pack versus unpack. We did the unpack before, and now we're doing the pack. It's very good. It's always important to make sure that you are doing this. Now, you can actually do this with a batch script or with PowerShell script from Visual Studio to actually invoke the solution packager with the pack switch. So there are ways to do that with PowerShell and kind of taking that process where you don't have to do it yourself and you're actually taking everything out and then running the scripts manually. So there are ways to automate that process. And once you've got everything together and you've made your changes, you're ready to import the solution. At this point, what you need to do is define. Once you go through this process, you're going to want to make sure that you've got the import order defined, as we talked about before. And what this shows you is the script that is necessary to kind of create the order of import. So as we talked about, we listed how, when we started talking about this process, we talked about how each of these solution groups, if you will, they're really a solution each, need to be imported in a particular order. And so this is the way that you can actually go through the process of scripting this out so that everything is deployed back into your Dynamics 365 environment correctly. We would actually use another tool that's part of this process called the package deployer. And there's a link here that you can cut and paste, or we can provide it as well as an actual text link for you to use. But then you can actually use the package deployer, and this can also be scripted and driven as part of that process. You can then use the package deployer to deploy that entire package of solutions back into your instance. Now, once you've got all those in your Dynamics 365 development instance, you can go through the process of doing customizations. And again, when you make these changes, you can then go through, once you've done your customizations, make whatever changes you need to the appropriate solutions. Then the next thing you're going to want to do is you have everything that you need, and you're ready to now bring it back in to make sure that you're going to resolve any potential conflicts where other people have been doing group development. So when you've done all of your modifications, you can go through the steps we talked about of how to get the solution out of your Dynamics 365 instance and bring it back into Visual Studio for the customizations that you performed. And then at the end of that, you have the ability then to go into Visual Studio and resolve conflicts. So when you go here and you're going to want to make sure that you're bringing things back in, you're going to use the merge tool as a process. And then if there are conflicts identified in Visual Studio, now you have the ability to see those and be able to manage that merge effectively in Visual Studio so that you can resolve the conflict and move forward with getting everything checked in. So, yeah, I know, as I mentioned before, it's very high level in terms of the things that we're covering, but I just wanted to make sure that we gave you an exposure to the things that were important in terms of how you go about this process. Not meaning to go too deep in any particular area in terms of what, using Visual Studio or going down the customization path, but just to kind of show you kind of a basic ALM model for managing your customizations, for using solutions and being able to effectively migrate those solutions across your instances, and determining based on your own development model, your development team, the model that you choose to use, which one may be appropriate for you, and then what tools you would be able to use to leverage that. So at this point, we are open for questions. So are there any additional questions? Couples, are there any questions that we haven't gotten to?
I think Balamurali had some question. Balamurali, would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
I think he had the question around. What happens if they accidentally install a managed solution and they don't have an unmanaged version. I think that's one where we're probably going to have to go. I don't know the answer to that one off the top of my head. That one's going to require a little bit of research. If we can capture, I think the best way to do this is for Bala to probably send this question via an email, or do we have Janice? We have emails for our attendees, correct? We have the log of the questions.
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Then what we'll do is we'll take a look at this and we will get an answer back to you. And then I'm not sure of the mechanisms that we have to make that answer more broadly available to other attendees, but I will work with our Infopedia folks to understand what we need to do if there's a way to make that answer available to everyone in a more broad manner. Are there other questions?
Yeah. So there is a new question from Balamurugan. Merging of customization typically a comparison on XML. Are you recommending to do the changes directly in XML?
No. We do not recommend to do the changes directly in XML. Bringing the XML files gives you the ability to detect those collisions in Visual Studio, and it gives you a much cleaner version management model. And that's the only thing, that's the only reason that we recommend doing that. We do not recommend making the XML changes directly. There are too many things that could happen from a corruption perspective, and you would not want to introduce that into your environment. So use the instance to make your changes as appropriate and export them like we discussed, and then import, decompose them, and then move them back over into your Visual Studio solution, and then check them in appropriately.
There's another question. Why Visual Studio Online? Can I use installed version of Visual Studio? Visual Studio, yeah.
Yes, you can. You just don't have that concept of the centralized project. You may want to, you may have to take all of your changes and use another tool potentially to do the broader solution management. But yes, you can if you're a single developer, or if you are in a coordinated model. For example, if you have 2 or 3 developers sitting there together, you can work out your solutions and your kind of break things apart. And this is where some of the manual governance comes in from a development process perspective. You want to be able to say, okay, so you're going to work on these things, and I'm going to work on these things, and he's going to work or she's going to work on these things. And then we'll all coordinate to make sure that we don't butt to each other. So yes, but it can work in Visual Studio. Any other questions? There we go. All right, so there was a question around why you can use Visual Studio. We answered that question, yes. Okay, let's see. Newbie to the CRM SDK, existing, let's see, enable, disable workflows. Is there an easy way to understand the metadata model? Other than just going through the documentation, if you go through our MSDN, or you go through our developer site, I believe the developer site's one of the links that I posted that will take you to the developer documentation. You can actually, there are probably maybe 200 or 300 pages altogether when you look at the different links around our metadata and how that's managed. But ultimately, dealing with some of those things, it may be better to drive that programmatically as part of your process. So for now, you move things over accordingly, and then do the enable. Not everything will be easily migratable through the solution process. It could be third-party controls. There may be other things, third-party components that you have to pull in. So it just depends on the different pieces. But yeah, the SDK is just the samples in the SDK are really just designed to give you kind of a basic introduction. A lot of, to be honest, what we're talking about here today is the same type of thing. What is the difference between Visual Studio
Um,
Online versus installed on this context? Other than that's just a version. If you're looking to keep a centralized version amongst multiple developers, you'd have to have some form of version control applied where it sits as a centralized project so that it can recognize changes from other developers. That's all. Otherwise, you have to do those. You have to segment your solutions so that different people work on different things, and you're managing so that there's no overlap. And then that way you can each develop in pieces without bumping into each other. Is it safe to work on Visual Studio Online installed with TFS?
yes.
Yeah. All right, so CRM SDK versus CRM Web API versus PowerShell. Yeah, that's so just really quickly on that one. The SDK is sort of the large container of what we provide that allow you to interact with Dynamics 365 via our APIs, if you will. The Web API is part of that. There are some samples in the SDK code of how to interact with the Web API. It's not really a separate thing versus the SDK. One of the things that, if you will, to just kind of give you a little bit of context, so we're moving towards the OData model for our Web API and moving away from the organization service, kind of early bound large C# code model to allow people to develop against Dynamics 365 with anything, with Java, with C++, with whatever language you choose to use to interact with it. So the Web API is an open source model interaction, but it's